Thank you, Provost Chase. I am Dr. Danica Hayes, Executive Associate Dean of the UNLV College of Education. As you noted, UNLV is on the road to becoming one of the top-tier 100 American research universities, as designated by the Carnegie Foundation, and we are honored to be a critical part of that journey. Throughout the day, I hope our speakers and experts demonstrate how the College of Education continues to be daring, different, and diverse. For us, those words are more than just a catchphrase. It's a core belief that guides how we approach our work. Through research, student interactions, our community presence, and an unwavering commitment to the future of education, we're changing the world in our state and beyond. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Phil Hansen. Referred to by his fans as the artist for the people, Phil Hansen is an internationally recognized multimedia artist, speaker, author, and innovator, at the forefront of bringing art to a wider audience. Crashing irreverently through conventional boundaries, Phil works at the intersection of traditional art, electronic media, offbeat materials, and interactive experiences. After developing a career-ending tremor in his drawing hand, Phil embraced his shake, both physically and metaphorically, by redefining his limitation as an impetus for creativity. Phil not only restored his artistic abilities, he became a much more creative and innovative artist than ever before. In the words of Phil himself, quote, "We need to first be limited in order to become limitless," end quote. I welcome Phil Hansen to the stage today to share with us a bit more on how he embraced the shake and succeeded. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Phil Hansen.
It is on. Hey, there we go. Good morning, everyone. Hey, at your tables, everybody has a piece of paper. I have to clip this. Let's see, a piece of paper about like this. Maybe you have one at your table, two at your table, maybe one directly in front of you. If you could go ahead and grab that. And if there's not enough at your table, if you would go ahead and tear it in half and hand it to the person next to you so they have one as well. So we want everybody to have one of these little pieces of paper. Everybody have one? Go ahead and hold it up. We got it, we got it. All right, so now, some of you already back toward up a little bit, but everybody else, go ahead and tear it up all the way. So everybody, that's the whole activity. I apologize, it's not that exciting. Just gonna tear up the piece of paper. Everybody, make sure everyone around you is. Just in half, not more? That's it? Yeah, shred it, there we go. All right, so that was the activity. Thank you for joining me in that. Simple, yay, sometimes life needs that, right? So as I was introduced, my name's Phil, I'm an artist, and one of the things that I have always loved about art and imagining art is being in the studio. You know, what would it be like to be in the studio around other people when they're creating art? So when I'm in galleries and museums, that's what I'm always thinking about. I'm looking at that art on the wall, but I'm trying to imagine what that experience was like. Was there music playing? What was the artist going through? Just where were they at that point in their life? And so when I started making my own art, that was something that I really began to dig into, was kind of the process itself. And of course, I enjoy that, but then I began to actually shoot video and make little videos of the creation process and posted those videos online for people to check out. And so that was ultimately what led me to being here today. But let me show you a little video that I made about a month and a half ago, a little introduction to the kind of the way that I work, I guess we can say. Hey, thank you. So that's the kind of stuff I do, make art. And that one was actually made a piece of paper that then I actually divided up a little bit more. I brought here, and you just destroyed that picture. Does that feel kind of weird, right? Probably, I'm imagining you haven't been asked to destroy art before. But sometimes in life, things need to be destroyed a little bit. They need to be torn up to be able to reimagine what's in front of us. And I feel like that's exactly what the College of Education is here to do, is to provide that space to dig into those hard questions and those difficult challenges in front of you, and to really try to reimagine how you're viewing everything that's in front of you. I never thought I would be an artist who would ask people to destroy my art. It's not a place I thought I'd be. And actually, for a long time, I never even thought I would be an artist, because there was a time in my life when that dream had completely fallen apart. But in the pursuit of putting that dream back together, I discovered something that's ultimately changed my life. I discovered that limitations are actually an opportunity in disguise, because they're what is needed in order to activate our creativity. And that's really what I'd like to share with you today, this idea that limitations aren't the end of our potential. They're merely the beginning. That limitations can be a passageway to success and continued innovation. And of course, it's not easy, but it is as simple as changing our beliefs about the things that hold us back. My story really starts back in middle school when I was first introduced to art. And then in high school, I was finally able to take my first art class because my parents told me I had to be in band. I couldn't be in art until as a sophomore I was able to decide for myself. And I decided to take art, and it was there that I was introduced to pointillism. And how many of you know what pointillism is, an artistic style? Hey, good number. All right. For everybody else, pointillism is just using dots, lots and lots of little tiny dots to make a picture. And at first, I was intrigued with pointillism, and then over time, I became completely obsessed with it, as many high schoolers find something to obsess about. And so I'd spend late evenings in my room just dotting away, making little pictures. And as I got better, the dots got smaller, until I was eventually working with a .005 millimeter pen. And those pens are tiny. And with dots that small, it takes an extremely steady and precise hand to not screw it up. But I was spending so much time perfecting dots that it began to take a toll on the nerves in my arm, and my hand began to shake. Now, what was happening is occasionally all of our hands shake naturally, right? That's not uncommon. Maybe stay up late or maybe too much caffeine in the morning. We all have a little tremor once in a while. But for me in art class, trying to do pointillism, that was problematic because I had to get the dot just perfectly placed. And so I would end up holding the pen really tight. And sometimes that wasn't quite enough, though, and so I'd end up just putting this death grip on the pen to keep it steady. But eventually, the act of holding the pen so tight became the cause of the shake. Because what would happen is I would be holding the pen really tight, and after a while, that tightness would actually cause fatigue. And so then my muscles would get tired, the joints would hurt, and so then it'd shake a little more. Well, I'd hold the pen tighter. Well, then my joints and muscles would fatigue more, and I'd just hold the pen tighter. It became this vicious cycle that just progressed until my hand shook constantly. And what had once started out as these beautiful, perfect little dots ended up looking more like tadpoles because of the shake. And eventually, it degraded to the point where I had trouble holding anything, and this was the straightest line I could draw. And after spending all of my artistic life perfecting dots, I really couldn't imagine being an artist in any other way. And so I dropped out of art school, and then a short time later, I just quit doing art completely. And I was away from art for a number of years before deciding to get back into it. And with some encouragement from a friend, I thought I'd go to a neurologist about the shake. I remember going through some different tests, and then the doctor sat me down and gave me the very simple yet hard diagnosis of permanent nerve damage. And I remember sitting there trying to absorb that news, trying to figure out what that was going to mean to me in my life. And the neurologist, obviously he's seen people go through these kinds of situations before, and so he's leaning back in his chair looking at me as I'm thinking about it. And he's like, son, your hand shakes. So why don't you just embrace the shake? And I'll admit, there was this one little moment where I'm like, are you serious right now? It was kind of a raw experience. And he's like, you're fine, just embrace the shake. I'm like, okay, maybe it's good advice, but I wasn't quite ready at that point in my life. But just a few short weeks later, I was heading home from college on the bus to my apartment, and I was thinking about this idea of embracing the shake. I was like, well, I'm an artist. I should be able to find a way to visualize embracing the shake. I hadn't really thought about what that would really look like. But that day, when I got home from school, I put a piece of paper on the wall, I grabbed a pencil and I just started letting my hand shake and shake, and I started making a bunch of scribble pictures. And even though it wasn't the kind of art that I was ultimately passionate about, it felt great. And more importantly, once I embraced the shake, I realized that I could still make art. I just had to find a different approach to making the kind of art that I wanted. Now, I still enjoyed the fragmentation of pointillism, seeing all those little tiny dots come together to create that unified whole. And so I began exploring and looking for different ways that I could fragment images where the shake wouldn't affect the work. And the easiest of which, of course, was to just get away from my hands completely. And so I proceeded to dip my feet in paint and walk on a canvas and made a picture of a homeless man named Paul who used to live down the street from me in Seattle. Or, in a 3D structure consisting of 2x4s, I created a 2D image by burning it with a blowtorch. I discovered that if I worked in a larger scale and with bigger materials, my hand wouldn't really hurt. I went from having a single approach to art to an approach to creativity that had completely changed my artistic horizons. That was the first time I'd encountered the idea that embracing limitation could actually drive creativity. Now, at the time, I was finishing up school, and if you can put yourself back to that time when you're going to be graduating, going to be able to afford new stuff, get that better paying job, pay off school loans, whatever it was for you. Everybody had their thing that they were excited about after graduation. And for me, it was all about upgrading my life, but I was an art nerd, so upgrading my life meant art supplies. So I got out of school, I got a job, I got my first paycheck, went to the art store, and I just went nuts buying everything I wanted. I took it all home, I cleaned my little studio space, which was actually just the corner of my apartment, and I set out all my new stuff, and I really set myself to task to try to create something that was just completely outside of the box. But I sat there for hours, and nothing came to mind. Same thing the next day, and the next, and the next. And I really found myself just quickly slipping into a creative slump. And I was in a dark place for a long time, unable to create. And it didn't even make any sense because, there I was finally able to support my art for the first time, and yet I was creatively blank. But as I searched around the darkness, I realized that I was paralyzed by all these choices I never had before. And it was then that I thought back to that experience in the doctor's office, being told to embrace the shake. And I realized if I ever wanted my creativity back, I had to quit trying so hard to think outside of the box and instead get back into it. And I began to wonder, could you become more creative if you were actually looking for limitations? And that was something I had never thought about in my life before. I'm like, well, let me give it a shot. What if I could only create art with like $1 worth of supplies and something just really minor? And so I had that idea in the back of my head for a little bit, but one evening I was at Starbucks doing all my work, which is where I always sit and get my work done. I'm sure everybody has their own favorite spot to go, late in the evening, get stuff done. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking at my coffee cup, and instead of putting that little brown sleeve on there, as they often do, they actually put a whole second cup, which is a little bit lazy, a little bit wasteful, but okay, whatever. But that night, I'm looking at that second cup, and I'm like, well, if they'll give me one cup for free, what will happen if I ask for like 50 cups? And it was the evening shift, and they did not care at all. And so with the pencils I already had, they just gave me this big old bag of cups, and I made this picture for only 80 cents. And this became this moment of clarification for me, that we need to first be limited in order to become limitless. I next took this approach of thinking inside the box to my canvas and wondered, well, if I can force myself to be creative and find success in that through limitations, maybe I should try it again. And I was looking at my canvas, and I had bought a bunch of canvases that were about that big when I was initially just kind of going nuts buying art supplies. And I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't be painting on that. Maybe I need to paint on something else. And so I began hunting around, looking for other things that I could paint on. And I initially, of course, as all artists want to do, is I wanted to be original. So I really set out to try to find something that artists have never painted on before, which will not work because artists have painted on everything. So that was a failure. All right. So then I just wanted to find something that felt original to me, at least, that I connected with. And I was just hunting and just couldn't find a thing. And then one night as I was getting ready for bed, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom. I'm looking in the mirror. I happened to glance at my chest, and I'm like, hey, my chest is actually about the same size as my canvas. Well, maybe I should paint a picture on my chest? Like, at that point, I was just questioning everything. I'm like, all right, I'll give it a shot. And so that night, I felt inspired, and I painted a picture on my chest. It actually worked out pretty well. And so then I was still working full-time as an X-ray tech. And so I took an entire weekend and painted 30 pictures on my chest, one layer at a time, one on top of another, with each picture representing an influence in my life. Get that video. It was amazing. That thing was like 1/3 of an inch thick by the time I peeled it off. I thought it was going to fragment. I'm like, it's going, it's going. It was oddly exciting to peel that off. But so that was rethinking the canvas, and then the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to rethink the brush, since I had kind of found an element of creativity in that, and it felt successful. And so I kind of jumped into the brush, and I'll spare you the story because it was pretty much the same story, kind of beat my head against the wall trying to find a different way to apply the paint. But one evening I was watching a movie, and I felt inspired by that movie. So.
'Cause I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers up on the right side. The record keeps spinning off the track. Like the same song keeps playing back. She lights a black to smoke in the bath. A bustin' this again, a bustin', a quick as light. A ring, ring, a hello operator. Give me what I need, you know what? I beat it into flavor. The doctor calls me out tonight, but I hope the stars don't put up a fight so bright. You pick up the phone, so hard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers up on the direct line.
Nothing better than Bruce Lee with karate chops. Oh, well, thank you. I didn't mean to encourage that. That's how I feel about that picture. And when I made that, what I didn't know is that at the time I was hitting the canvas so hard that I was actually pushing the paint through the canvas. And so I left that picture up on the wall for a few months after I made it because it was just too fun to have up. Of course, it's massive. The thing's like 14 feet wide. But by the time I actually wanted to take it down, I went up and I was pulling the push pins out of the top, and the picture stuck. I'm like, what's going on here? So I grabbed the corner of it, and I had to like peel it off of the wall. But the upside was I ended up having this like ghostly Bruce Lee left over on the wall afterwards. It was like, yeah! Till eventually, of course, I had to paint over it, which was kind of a bummer. So that was rethinking the canvas and the brush. And so the next thing I wanted to do was I wanted to rethink the material that actually went onto the canvas. And what if instead of relying on myself, what if I had to rely on other people to help create the content for the art? So for 6 days, I lived in the garage, I slept on the floor, and I ate delivery. And I asked people to call me and share a story with me about a life-changing moment. And those stories were handwritten with a Sharpie onto this giant 10-foot revolving canvas. And if you can see it there, those stories became the art by the spacing of the letters. Now, the thing that those 3 pieces still have in common is they still exist. They're still somewhere in the world. So then that kind of sent me down this further path. So as an artist, I was making all this art, and it was just kind of filling up the studio. And I was looking at all this art, and I'm like, does it need to exist? And that felt like really the ultimate limitation. You know, could I be an artist without art? And this idea slowly turned into a year-long project that I called Goodbye Art, where the idea was that each and every piece of art had to be destroyed after its creation. In the beginning of Goodbye Art, I focused on forced destruction, like this image of Jimi Hendrix coming together here. This is made with over 7,000 matches that have been colored and hot glued together. And we'll listen for a moment as this puppy burns. This is the real sound of this thing burning. And then I opened it up to creating art that was destroyed naturally. I looked for temporary materials, and some of you just had snacks, so I apologize, but chewing up and spitting out food. I made a chewed up and spit out Britney Spears. Hey! Or using sidewalk chalk and just drawing stick figures. Tens of thousands of stick figures. This whole picture is about 45 feet wide or so. Massive. Or on a very, very cold Minnesota winter night, taking wine outside to freeze and then bringing it back inside to thaw. This is just red and white wine. The last iteration of destruction was to try to produce something that didn't actually exist in the first place. So what I did is I took a bunch of candles, tea candles, I laid them out on the table, I lit them, and then I blew them out. And then I repeated that process over and over and over with the same set of candles. And then I assembled all the little bits of video into the larger image. So this end image was never visible as a physical whole. It was destroyed before it ever existed. Well, thank you. In the course of this Goodbye Art series, I created 23 different pieces with nothing physical left to display. What I thought would be the ultimate limitation really turned out to be the ultimate liberation, as each time I created, the destruction brought me back to a neutral place where I felt refreshed and ready to start the next project. But of course, it didn't happen overnight. There were times my projects failed to get off the ground, or even worse, after spending tons of time on something, the end image was kind of embarrassing. But having committed to that process, I continued on, and something really surprising happened. As I was destroying each piece, I was really learning to let go. Let go of outcomes, let go of failures, and let go of imperfections. And in return, I found a process of creating art that was perpetual and unencumbered by result. I found myself just in a state of constant creation, thinking only of what's next and coming up with more ideas than I ever had before. That willingness to explore that I developed in Goodbye Art, and the willingness to fail, which I didn't show you all those videos, but there's a lot of failure in that series. That willingness to just kind of jump in and see what happens led me to create lots of really unique videos that have been seen by tens of millions of people online, and as well to create a really unique career as an artist. I've done all kinds of commission work. I made a piece for the Rockefeller Foundation a little while ago. One time Disney reached out and asked me to make a video for the release of the movie Cars 2. So I had to very quickly learn how to paint with the remote control cars. It's applied, all the paint's applied just with cars. And the Grammys asked me to be the official artist for the Grammys one year, so I painted a picture where the negative space creates the Grammy image. So the people create the Grammy, which is of course really what they're all about. And probably the most unusual part of making a living as an artist is being here in front of people speaking. This is the last place that most artists would ever expect to find themselves. You know, we're usually in a studio somewhere, off painting in the corner and being extremely happy there. But when TED reached out and asked me to speak at their annual conference, of course I couldn't say no. And that just became this wonderful journey of self-discovery. And I've since had the opportunity to share my story with all kinds of groups of people, really just trying to help people see their limitations in a different light. And seeing our limitations differently really comes from being open to the process of exploring what's in front of us from different perspectives. And I brought a piece of art with me today that I think really exemplifies this idea of shifting how we see what's in front of us. Let me kick up the light here and I'll explain a little bit before I jump in too far. So I've always been interested in light and shadow. And of course, as an artist, you have to have light to be able to create any sort of art. And the thing that I ended up finding so fascinating about shadows is that the object, in this case my hand, depending on how far the object is from where the shadow falls, the properties of the shadow change. Very simple, but what I ultimately found is that I can use that to make art. Because if I have something close to where the shadow falls, it's nice and dark and crisp. But if I have something that's further away, you can already see it's lighter and fuzzier. If you take it to the extreme, like my pinky is almost starting to disappear a little bit. So that allows me to really manipulate shadows. And what I found is that by putting little blobs of paint on plexiglass, if I hold that close to where the shadow falls, the shadows are nice and dark and crisp. And as I move it further and further away, you can see it almost just becomes a shade of gray at a certain point. So let me get these put in here. I'll show you what we got going on. You know, our success when we run into a challenge, whether as an artist like me or in a place of education like you, our success really depends on our ability, as I said, to kind of shift how we see what's in front of us. So if I turn this picture this way, well, it's kind of pretty, but there's not a whole lot there. Maybe a nice psychological test for what do you see. But if I turn it around, if I shift our perspective, we get an entirely different picture. And that is just, oh, thank you. And that is just using that variation to create those shades. And I discovered this partway through. This is completely unintentional. I think it's this one. Yeah, here we go. And the woman in the picture here is Frida Kahlo. And if you don't know her work, she was the one who would always paint herself with the really thick unibrow. And she had a unibrow. It wasn't quite as prominent as she may have seen it in her own light when she reflected on herself. And if you haven't ever seen her work, absolutely should check it out. She did amazing, amazing stuff. You know, when I think back to my 3 years away from art, away from my dream, just going through the motions, instead of looking for a different way to continue that dream, I quit. You know, I gave up. And what if I didn't embrace the shake? Doing so wasn't just about art and having art skills. It was about life and having life skills. Embracing the shake is about building our foundational skills so we can untap our potential when we need it most, so we can always find our way to that story of transformation. And the journey to finding transformation really forced me to rethink my whole approach to limitations. And I've since come to realize that when we change, if we can click back over to the presentation there, apparently there's a button on here I'm not supposed to hit. That popped up. There we go. This is what I realized, that when we change the way we look at a limitation, it changes how it affects us. You know, this is ultimately very straightforward and very obvious, that if we run into a limitation, and if we see it as a roadblock, it prevents us from seeing the possibilities. But if we choose to embrace limitations, it opens us up to new opportunities. But of course, realizing this alone doesn't help us change. In order to change our paradigm about limitations, we must first understand the nature of the limits that are actually holding us back. Because after all, facing limitations is not a new phenomenon, is it? No. It's a phenomenon of existence, that at every turn, at every point in our lives, we are constantly confronted with limitations. Yet, unlike playing a sport or an instrument where we get better with practice, most of us tend to get just a little bit worse with each limitation we run into, because we expect them to be awful and unpleasant, and so we try avoiding them at all costs. But it ends up costing us our future, our potential, and certainly our happiness. In trying to better understand the mechanisms that would allow one person to transform a limitation while someone else struggled with the same one, if you can imagine asking that kind of a big life question, you know, how is it that you can have the same limitation but then people experience it totally differently? As an artist, of course, what we always end up doing is we find a way to turn it into a piece of art. And so I decided I was going to do another one of these really large-scale text art pieces, like that circular piece I showed you earlier. That's, you know, they fascinated me, asking people to share stories and writing those stories down. And with this project, I also wanted to run a Kickstarter campaign to fund the creation of a short documentary about the piece. So I posted my phone number online. I asked people to call me and share a story with me about a limitation that they faced. I spoke with people from England, France, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Australia, Angola. There were over 30 countries in total in every single state in the United States. And as this project was progressing, CNN reached out and asked if I'd write an opinion piece about the experience, which I didn't have any opinions at that point, but I went for it anyway, of course. Don't want to miss that opportunity. And after an entire month of handwriting, I found myself staring at this sea of stories. There's over 1,000 handwritten stories in this piece. And as I went through the motions of wrapping up the Kickstarter campaign, sending out all the rewards, and overseeing the creation of a short documentary, I began to pore through these stories, looking for patterns. I called people back, discussed their stories in detail, and slowly I discovered that the key to changing the way we think about a limitation lies in the distinction between a limitation and a self-limiting belief. Now, I've now taken this further in my life to believe that this is what every single challenge we confront is composed of. Every challenge has these two elements. One, it has the limitation, which is something that we can all agree upon is there. But then it also has a self-limiting belief. And I call it that because, of course, if we run into a limitation but we don't see it as a challenge, then that means we just are kind of moving over it. We're not really engaging with it in a way that is holding us back. And so when things hold us back, I really believe that there's a strong element of a self-limiting belief attached to it. And you can very easily see this in, let's say you're working in a group of like maybe 3 to 5 people, somewhere in that range, where when you have a new constraint imposed upon you, a new challenge that you're facing, in that little group, you can often have one person who's just like, well, okay, we have to change a few things and boom, we're back on track and we can keep going. But then maybe at the same time, and I'm sure we've all experienced this at one time or another, there's somebody in the group who's just like, hand on their head, they're like, oh, geez, what are we going to do? This changes everything. We can't continue the way that we want to. Oh, this is really going to hold us back. And that person, in some ways, is probably right. There's not a way that you can move forward with the same intention, the same result. But if you shifted a little bit of things, oftentimes that self-limiting belief, then that's where you can really get transformation to come from. So to put it simply, a limitation is something that's been put in our way, whereas a self-limiting belief is something that we have put in our own way. And it's really important to distinguish between those two because a limitation is, after all, simply an obstacle. There's still paths around it. There's still room for possibilities. Whereas those self-limiting beliefs, they block all paths and don't allow for possibilities. As I talked with more and more people who called in for this project, I started to see these self-limiting beliefs coming out bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. And of course, as you can imagine, if somebody is experiencing a limitation, when they actually transform that limitation is still there. But it's actually that belief that shifted. So as I talked to people, I started to discover that. The gentleman who called in who suffered from, well, any sort of issue, that after he transformed that, it was actually the belief that shifted because that limitation is always still present. And so I began to dig into these and look and dig deeper. And in every single story, I found that self-limiting belief went back further and further in childhood. And actually, how many of you have young kids in your life? Little ones, maybe nieces, nephews, grandkids, whatever the case. A good chunk. All right. So think if these pictures remind you of any of those young ones that you know in your life then. It was the greatest yearbook quote ever. A little hard to read from the back there. My one wish is for it to rain tacos. And this one's probably a little hard to read. It says, there once was a bear who had purple hair. That's rare, so Bob attacked him. And that's Bob jumping out of the tree with a nice mafia mallet in his hand. It's pretty easy to be envious of kids' imagination, of course. They are unabashed, they run amok, and their curiosities lead them to come up with some pretty awesome things at times. And I'm sure we can all recall a time in our own lives when life was just that completely wide open. I remember when I was in kindergarten, I always loved playing hide and seek. I remember I was like, what if I practice really hard? Maybe someday I can become like a professional hide and seeker. Which I did get better, but I also did legitimately think there was a professional hide and seek league. It just made sense. We had leagues for everything else. Why not hide and seek? And in the first grade, I thought I had my dream of being able to fly figured out. I just had to paint wings on myself, and then I could fly. It was so obvious. And in the third grade, my dad told me there was only one place in all of America where 4 states come together to create what's called the Four Corners, which you all are very familiar with. But as a little kid, I lived in Washington State, and I'm looking at this map, and the world is new to me at that point. So I'm looking at this map, and I'm like, Dad, it's a pretty big country. What if nobody's looked hard enough? And so in third grade, every single day after school, I would come home and I'd pull out the atlas, because we still had atlases back then, pull out the atlas and I would dig through just like tracing all the states, looking for more four corners. I was absolutely convinced I was going to make the next great discovery. You know, as kids, we all have dreams. Dreams of who and what we want to be when we grow up. We ask what-if questions, and we believe that anything is possible. But slowly, as we grow older, adults tell us what we can and cannot do. Our world of possibilities closes in, and in its place, we live our lives in certainty. And over time, we become those same adults. And instead of believing in what if, we slowly learn to believe in what is. And this is a belief system that is instilled over the course of our lives, and it comes to dictate how we live our lives. And I don't think any of us probably in the world have escaped that transition. So I traced these self-limiting beliefs back to that shift into adulthood, from what if to what is, from uncertainty to certainty. Because as kids, we believe that nothing can hold us back from any task. Yet, we live in a world that yearns for certainty. So over time, we develop limiting beliefs based on our interpretation of our experiences and what society has conditioned us to see. These usually include words like can't, won't, never, always. You know, I can't get it done because, it just won't work the same way because. And those statements are always true, right? Going back to that limitation, self-limiting belief, those statements are true. There is that limitation, but there's often that belief. And I ran into these kinds of stories just time and time and time again, where somebody would call in and be telling me about their story, and they were like, well, I can't do this. And they'd always have that negativity from the very initial statement. And as you can imagine, when you post your phone number online and ask people to call you, people call you. People will call you relentlessly. And after a while, as I'm doing this huge project, people are calling me day and night, and I decided I was going to set some parameters. And so I decided I'd start taking calls at 8 o'clock in the morning and stop taking calls at 8 o'clock at night. So it seemed like a pretty sizable window. Somebody could overlap me if they really wanted to. And let's see, probably about 8:45 one night, maybe 2 weeks into the whole project, my phone starts ringing and ringing and ringing, and it's on the counter charging, so I click it to silent, and it's buzzing and buzzing and buzzing. I'm like, well, clearly this person wants to share their story. So I answered the phone, and it was a young woman named Sarah. And I'm going to share Sarah's story with you, but let me give you a little bit of a background on her. So she had 3 elements that were kind of all coming together in her life. The first is that she suffered from a disorder called trichotillomania. And this is a disorder that causes people to pull their hair out uncontrollably. And second, she was from a low-income family, which meant that there were nonprofits that would provide her with wigs because she was still in high school. Except the third thing is that she was a week away from graduating high school when I spoke to her. And the nonprofits had a cutoff date for being provided with wigs of graduation. So all of a sudden, she found herself facing this completely unknown future, with a massive element in her life that she just couldn't maybe no longer control. And I'd like to share Sarah's story with you because I ended up capturing an interview with her before and after her graduation in the course of this whole project. And I made it part of the short documentary about that series. So here's Sarah.
I was diagnosed with an impulse control disorder called trichotillomania. I am trying to embrace the limitation by getting rid of my wigs and shaving my head. But that's scary, especially for a girl, where the expectation is that you have hair and that your hair is beautiful and that your hair is thick and luscious and lovely. Man, I can't tell you how many times I have been so tormented by that expectation. If I can learn to forgive myself for something that I can't control, I need to stop hiding. I'm just going to do it then. I'm just going to say, hey, could you shave my head now? Because after graduation, I'm just going to discard of this.
Boss from busy teaching me my lessons. Love is not what I come to expect from you. But people gonna send me a love like this. I'm surely gonna glance at the sky.
My state of mind was like realizing for the first time what my reality was. I was pulling off a mask, and I wasn't sure if I liked what I saw underneath it, because I was wearing the mask for everyone else, but I didn't realize that I had been wearing it myself as well. I just remember feeling so stifled by doors that were closed all around me. I couldn't go to sleepovers and have my hair braided. Didn't let my boyfriend ever touch my hair. No swimming, no roller coasters, not rolling the windows down. Something that I thought was giving me freedom was actually holding me back. And now that I've gotten rid of it, it's like all around me, doors have just flown open. And I can do whatever I want. I can do whatever I want. And it feels so good. It feels so good.
Amazing story, right? I was so fortunate to have been able to overlap that point in Sarah's life. And she emails me once in a while and let me know that things are going pretty well, and that she will actually watch that video from time to time and be like, whoa, I went through that, and where she's at today. And she actually sent me an updated picture of herself not long ago. And here's Sarah. And she said that she's doing great. And that for now, the trichotillomania is dormant. But that's actually the challenge about that kind of a disorder, is that it's always there. And so, maybe weeks, months, decades down the road, it could reveal itself, and she could find herself going through that whole experience again. And one thing that Sarah said that just surprised me so much was that she spent so much time trying to control her disorder that once she finally let go of that control, she realized she never had any to begin with. And she was just so analytical of herself and being able to just speak very eloquently on the challenge that she faced. It was quite amazing. When I think back to my own story after seeing Sarah's, I feel like my limitation was pretty straightforward. It was that my hand shakes. But it was my self-limiting belief that got me into trouble, that in order to be an artist, you need a steady hand. And I think I've hopefully proven to you today that as an artist with that limitation, there are still a million ways to make art. But you can imagine, as an artist with that self-limiting belief, that would prevent someone from moving forward. What I thought for a long time was that my hand shakes, I can't do art, which now you can see is just riddled with self-limiting beliefs. But what happened over time is that statement slowly transitioned into a question. How can I do art with a shaky hand? By asking the right questions, limitations can become the passageway to creativity. So think about where you are, what obstacles, roadblocks, challenges are in front of you, but also, of course, what self-limiting beliefs do you have attached to those limitations? And then begin to sort of step back and separate the two. I've found literally naming the two to be quite powerful, because then it allows you to look at the limitation and ask yourself questions about that limitation, and then you can get creative with that, because that limitation is an obstacle. And then over time, where the real transformation comes from is when we slowly work on those beliefs and begin to shift how we see what's in front of us. But there's one thing that I think we all have in common. And that is that when we run into a challenge, when we run into a roadblock, all of us actually have the same self-limiting belief. And that belief is that we need to look on the outside for help. When we hit that obstacle that blocks our path, so many of us think we need more people, more tools, and more money. And this is, of course, a very natural tendency, because when times are good, we can rely on more people, more money, and more tools. And so we build this habit of counting on external resources. But what happens when those resources become scarce? That is when we tend to go into a holding pattern until things flow again. Like during the last recession, I'm sure many of you saw businesses and maybe colleagues who decided to just kind of wait it out, see where things went. But what's so dangerous about that is we end up diverting our attention to the lack of resources, which creates a habit of noticing things that are out of our control rather than the things we can control. And if you think about it, it's the challenging times that actually provide us with so much more opportunity for success. And it's in those challenging times that we must recognize that we rely far too much on external resources, when the most valuable resources we have are within us, our internal resources. We are the source that makes everything happen. And while others can leave their future, their business up to fate, we can choose to get ahead by tapping into what we have on the inside. And an amazingly simple yet powerful thing happens when we tap into what we have on the inside. Those resources that are available to us on the outside can go so much further. And there are people who achieve success every day despite and often as a result of limited resources. I think probably some of the most notable are those who took little to nothing and turned them into some of the big companies that we can recognize today. And the easiest place to start there is, of course, with what many of us have in our pockets, Apple, and how, like many tech companies, it started in some young guy's garage. But the thing that I didn't know is that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, they didn't have the money to buy the parts for the first 50 computers. They had to use credit. And of course, they turned that into the global dominating brand that it is today. Starbucks was founded by a history teacher, an English teacher, and a writer. And they each put in only $1,500 of their own money to open the first Starbucks in Pike Place Market in Seattle. And then since have awash the world in coffee. Quite lovely, I appreciate it. And let's see, I have a little fun fact for you. The very, very first product ever sold on eBay was a laser pointer. But not just any laser pointer, it was a broken laser pointer. And it was sold by Pierre Omidyar. And Pierre was a guy with a dream and an ability to code. So he started eBay in his living room and working in his slippers and his pajamas. Within the first year, had $10,000 in revenue. Only $10,000 from the first year of eBay. And then, I checked the numbers just the other day, $31 billion in assets. Kind of crazy, right? I think it's such a beautiful example of somebody who took what they had on the inside and that small chunk or some of those, no chunks of resources to just kind of run crazy with it. As you continue to imagine what the future holds, what the future of education holds for you, if you would take a minute and just imagine one more thing. Can you imagine what you could do if you embrace the limitations that are in front of you? I know that you all have worked extremely hard to get where you are today. You're constantly dealing with the complexities of education. So you know what it's like to run into lots of limitations and uncertainties along the way. And I'm sure you all have heard and shared stories of transformation before. And as much as I'm here to share my story with you, what I'd really like to do is actually remind you of your own story and your potential for continued transformation. And to inform you that we've been misguided about the true meaning behind limitations. And we've been undermining our amazingly resilient and creative nature. Embrace the shake is more than just changing our attitude towards something that's outside of us. It's about changing our attitude towards ourselves. Real change comes from the inside. Embrace the shake is embracing ourselves and believing in our tremendous capacity to adjust to whatever comes our way. There are solutions to every problem if we're willing to stay open to unexpected sources. To get there, we don't need more people, more tools, more time, or more money. Of course, those things are great, and if you can get them, run with it. But our most valuable resources are our internal resources, our creativity, our adaptability, our imagination, and of course, our resilience. And when you invite yourself to see limitations as opportunities, you'll find that there's not a future we are supposed to have. There is a future that we get to create by perpetually rethinking, reframing, and recrafting. And for me, looking at limitations as a source of creativity completely changed the course of my life. Now when I run into a barrier, I find myself creatively stumped. I still struggle. That will never change. That will never end. But I continue to show up for that process, and I always try to remind myself of the possibilities. Like using hundreds of real worms to make an image, or using a push pin and 4 hours to tattoo a banana. and then watch it degrade. Or if you've ever been to one of those burger joints where the burgers are just greasy and amazing and delicious, but by the time you look at the bag that they came in when you're done, it's kind of transparent, it's kind of disgusting. But what you can do with a bag of greasy hamburgers. And thank you. Actually, let's see. How many burgers do you think it took? Somebody from over in this area. How many burgers? Anybody? Nobody wants to guess? 24. 50. 500. 14. That was why they threw them all at me at the end. We're like, what do we do with all these burgers? All right, just huck them at me, I guess. Nobody on the set ate burgers for a while after that. I promise you that. You know, limitations may be the most unlikely of places to look for or harness creativity. But perhaps it's one of the best ways to get ourselves out of ruts, to rethink categories and to challenge accepted norms. So instead of telling each other to seize the day, maybe we can remind ourselves every day to seize the limitation. Thank you so much. And I do believe we have a little time for some Q&A. If anybody has any questions on the creativity side, on arts, questions of taking a limitation and tearing it apart, any questions? Go ahead and shoot your hand up. We have somebody with a microphone walking around here. We have a question up here. If you want to shout it out, I'll repeat you real quick. Or here we go.
What I think is so interesting is that what you've taken, the thing that I thought was so interesting is that you've shared your life with so many other people, and you've had the experience of dealing with people that had great limitations. Did you listen to them or counsel them or both? I'm really interested in listening to what you have to say about that.
In terms of that big art project that I did, and just kind of, I guess, in life in general.
Right.
I mean, yeah. So with that big art project, yeah, I mean, I spoke with people that were just going through amazingly difficult times in life. And there were some people who called and shared stories with me that they hadn't even told their family. And they were just, there was an outlet. All of a sudden, here was somebody who would listen, who would write it down if requested, but maybe who wouldn't if they didn't want me to. And
But like Sarah, it seemed to me that you really helped her in a lot of ways.
I tried to, hopefully I did, but hopefully that was just through sharing my own story and the interaction with her. But I tried to really keep an appropriate distance, because I don't think of myself or kind of, I've never gone through any training, so I'd hate to give somebody like real advice, specific advice about a challenge that they would face. I think all of us need to go through our own experiences. And what I found is that so many times that transformation comes from some element of a push. And actually, so as much as it's an inside thing, it's actually, there's often an outside source. And you can see this very easily in, maybe a kid in high school or somebody getting into college, where you can have one person who just tells them, probably a parent, the same thing over and over and over and over. And they just kind of keep going down the path that they want. But then they hear it from one teacher one day, and all of a sudden they're like, wait a second, and their life completely transforms. And so that was one thing that I always found to be quite interesting. And so I try not to push people, because I always feel like people will find the information that they need when they need it. But,
Thank you.
yeah. Anybody else? We got one back there.
What a wonderful speech.
Oh, thank you.
Do you have a version of this for different ages of children?
Well, so let's see. So I gave that TED Talk a few years ago, and so the TED Talk really encompasses kind of my personal story So it's about 8 minutes, 9 minutes or so, and you can find that on TED. And I've actually had teachers who were about third grade and up who reached out and said, hey, I wasn't sure how my kids would respond to it, but they said that, I mean, you know, kids absorb what they do and what they don't. Maybe it goes over their head, but the kids would watch the talk and be like, I'm ready to embrace the shake. And they got the core message of it for sure. So, yeah. So on TED, that'd be the best place to find it. Anybody else? Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for all your time. I'll be around for a little bit if you want to chat. Thank you.